I recently read Rich Paul's memoir called Lucky Me, a memoir of changing the odds. So for today's video, I thought I'd just ramble about it a bit, and I've got a basketball that might come in and out for some intermittent tapping. What else do we have? I don't know how that sounds. But I do want to take some time to really get into this book, so let's get started. And I have to say, I'd recommend that just about anyone pick up this book. There's really something in it for everyone. I was interested in it because I was interested in the life of a sports agent who's, considered probably the most powerful sports agent of the current, of the modern day. And the fact that he comes from a very different background than I think still most sports agents today, will have an MBA, a JD, and will have had a pretty clear path to that world. And I was really interested to find out sort of where he came from and how that all came together to sort of get him where he is today. But I also think that different people get different things out of it. I think for a lot of people, it could serve as sort of like an aspirational book, a business book, and we'll get into that. But for those of you who might not know who Rich Paul is, he might be most famously known as LeBron James' agent. He's the founder of Clutch Sports Group, which represents hundreds of athletes, including Draymond Green, Trae Young, Anthony Davis. And if you're a casual basketball fan, you might have heard of the Rich Paul rule, which was a rule that the NCAA tried to sort of establish in 2019 that required their agents to have bachelor's degrees. They walked it back pretty quickly, I think within a matter of weeks, because it caused such huge outrage, but it was known as the Rich Paul rule, because he, famously sort of had a background that was different. What is this? There you go. So the book is a pretty quick read. I think I read it all in one sitting. I just couldn't put it down. It's really, really engaging, and it's really, it's a story about how Cleveland made him. In fact, the book is organized in sort of rules, where every chapter has an associated rule, and then the chapter sort of tells a story or two of how he sort of came to learn that rule in his environment. And once again, those rules can be applied to life, they can be applied to business. So really a lot for anyone to gain from the book. The title, Lucky Me, is first of all a reference to the Jay-Z song. And music is a theme that sort of comes up a lot in the book, as is fashion, actually. Fashion had a big part to play throughout his life, and we'll get into it, but it's also, the whole book sort of leads up to him meeting LeBron. And he ended up connecting with LeBron over a jersey, but we won't get into that yet. And it's also a reference to how people sort of like to say that he got lucky. Sort of his naysayers say that he just got lucky because he met LeBron and now he is where he is. But in fact, LeBron wrote the introduction for the book, and he says himself that he's never given anything to anyone who didn't deserve it and work for it. Actually, let me pull up a quote. Set this down. Okay, it's just gonna roll around. Maybe I should have cleaned it. That's my outdoor ball. But in the introduction, Rich sort of talks about the theme of luck as well. He says, "My first stroke of luck was being born into a life that forced me to be focused and prepared. Luck was learning how to recognize friendship, loyalty, love, and justice, and how to cultivate those values in life and business. Learning how to confront systems of power and not flinch, to walk on a razor's edge and never fall. Most importantly, I was lucky to learn from real G's how to have a purpose and mission that can make a difference in people's lives, and that maybe someday can change the world. You want to call me lucky? Okay, bet. I was lucky from the very beginning." And that sets up, I think, the story of his life that he tells really, really well. And I really did appreciate how he sort of set the tone by giving an idea of what Cleveland was like in the 80s. The industrial decline of being in the Rust Belt. The economy was harsh, and it all sort of led to the arrival of crack in his neighborhood and in America. And that plays a huge part in his childhood. And in fact, the way he writes about the realities of being a Black American at the time, it's obviously a subject that you can get really deep into and that you should get really deep into. But as a Canadian, my sort of education on the social and political history of Black Americans really started as an adult. And it really struck me how in very few sentences Rich explained so clearly and so succinctly some of that background. And so I really appreciated that, that's not necessarily what his book is about, but he does give you that context of, what had led on a grander scale, what had led to the life that Black Americans in ghettos were living at the time. So I really appreciated how clear he was on that, and I learned a lot from it. But all that said, let's get into his story. Again, I encourage you to pick up this book. If anything I talk about in this video piques your interest, it's a fascinating story. It's very well written. And Rich isn't afraid to be honest and vulnerable in telling his story, and that's one of the things I think that makes the book so great. It's not very long, but that's good because you won't be able to put it down anyway. So let's grab the ball back. So he grew up with his father was the caretaker of the family, at least financially. He had another family, so he didn't see Rich every day, or Rich didn't see his dad every day. When his dad did see him, he always gave him money, but he was a kid and he didn't see him every day. So I guess the concept of saving up for a rainy day, you're 6 years old, just wasn't fully formed. So sometimes he'd go around and scrape together what he could in the neighborhood. His dad owned a corner store in the neighborhood. This is all in Cleveland, and Rich says that everything he learned in that store. And it's a setting that keeps coming up in the book. It's also worth noting for the story that his dad taught him how to play craps at 6 years old. His mom, on the other hand, dealt with addiction. So she wasn't always around. She was often away from the home. And he actually talks, he talks very well about addiction. And he talks well about his mother. This seems to be obviously the reflection of an adult. But he doesn't fault her necessarily for being away from the home. He said he's glad that she never got high around the kids. So, the fact that she was addicted, but she never brought it home is ultimately a positive thing. So, he was raised in part by his sister Brandy. She had a big impact on actually the role that clothing ended up playing in his life. He talks about when she was 12 or 13 years old, and she would bring him to the shopping mall, but over an hour away on a bus ride. And that's where he started seeing brands and seeing clothes that he was interested in. And in turn, he said that, let me see if I can pull up a quote here. He said that, the praise that he got for dressing well helped him soothe the pain of his mother's absence. He talks about ironing his clothes every day for school and getting the pleats just right. I have this part highlighted. Over the years, I've heard a lot of negative comments from outside our community about how poor black people spend so much money on sneakers or the latest iPhone. Here's what they don't understand. When I was a kid, everything felt surface deep in my life. There was nothing to get to the bottom of. We were conditioned to think that getting and spending money defines success. Today, I hear people talk about getting the bag. Very few people talk about building something that provides the bag. I tell the athletes and other young people I mentor to use their resources to find opportunities to build something, to believe in it, bet on it, and do everything they can to add value. The rest will come. But all of that was beyond me as a kid. When you live in an environment that's liable to spin out of control at any moment, a a fresh pair of sneakers and a sharply pressed outfit will hold you down. So, yeah, at 7 or 8 years old, he was working in his dad's shop, and he talks about that block and later about Cleveland as sort of the only world he knew, and about how impossible it was for him and people like him to imagine a world beyond it. So again, with the crack epidemic coming to Cleveland, he was dodging gunfights regularly. Robberies and break-ins were becoming more common, I guess. Kids were running around without guidance from adults. And he even tells the story of his sister, child services, or, the equivalent of what it was in Cleveland at the time, coming to the house to check on them while there was no parents in the house. And his sister had jumped out the window, run over to a neighbor's house to grab an adult to pretend to be their parent so that they wouldn't be split up in the foster system, in foster care. So that's sort of the environment that he was dealing with. And he writes really beautifully, Rich does, about the people in the neighborhood, and especially their interactions with him and his father at the store. And he turns those into lessons, right? So one example is a guy who was he was the dangerous guy on the block. He was unpredictable. You knew he was always carrying. And one of the things that Rich's dad did at the store sort of took care of the neighborhood, right? So if someone wanted to come in, buy something on credit, and pay for it on their payday, then he would do that. So this one guy, the dangerous guy, comes in one day, sort of puts I think it was a 40 on the counter, and says, I'm good, right? I'm taking this. And Rich's dad says, yeah, you're good. But he had still not paid for his previous purchase on credit. And this was all a lesson in people management for Rich. Because as the guy who's taking the 40 is sort of about to step out the door, that's when his dad calls out and says, you still haven't paid for your last purchase. So this is the last time you're buying something on credit until you bring in money. And so that's just, he goes on about how he learned relationships and people management from situations like that. And so the book is full of these interesting interactions that all tie into the rules that Rich is setting out and the lessons of each chapter. So meanwhile, he's making a lot of good money playing craps. He sort of goes into the technique and the strategy. It's really interesting. But when he's 11, he wants, more consistent income. So he decides he's going to deal. But he doesn't want to deal in crack. Not only is that a really dangerous sort of business to get into, but that's his mother's substance. So he doesn't want to get into crack, so he starts selling weed. And again, a lot of that money starts going towards clothes and cars. Maybe I can pull something up again, because I remember I highlighted a few things out of that chapter. So, I think by this time he's in high school, and this is a chapter that really stuck with me for a few different reasons. But he says, I can admit now that I had an addiction to fly clothes, not just as fashion, but for the feeling they gave me, the affirmation I received from my peers. When you live in a house... Oh, I lost it. Here it is. When you live in a house of pain, that kind of affirmation is like a drug that makes it all feel better. When I was alone, vulnerable, and needed a dependable source of love, where could I get that feeling? From having the new $160 Chris Webber Nikes on my feet, white and navy with the air bubble and Webber's number 2 on the back, and then the next week having a totally different pair of sneakers. Was it healthy? No, but I never turned to using drugs. No blunts, joints, pills, sherm, none of that. My high was being fly. It wasn't love, but what's love got to do with it? And so another chapter that really sort of stuck with me, another story from that chapter, is so by this time he's in high school, and he started going to a private high school, playing basketball, and he sort of realizes at one point from working in the store that he feels like he's missing out on life on the block. So he decides that he's going to flunk out, because he figures if he flunks out, he'll go back to his neighborhood school, public school, and be part of that life again. So he's in his dad's car one day, just casual ride, and his dad, sort of out of the blue, says, you know what happened to Marvin Gaye, right? You know the story of what really happened to him. And Rich says, didn't he die of an overdose? And his father says, oh, Marvin Gaye's father shot him, and he never did a day in jail. And while Rich is sort of processing what his dad's saying, his father says, someone at your school called, and you have a, I think, 1.6, 1.4 GPA, and the teachers are telling me that you tested well coming into the school, so I know you're not applying yourself. And Rich knew that his dad always carried a gun, and he sort of lifts his armrest and shows Rich the .38 pistol that he's carrying. And let's see what Rich said. Let's use his own words. He says, that moment changed the trajectory of my life, not all at once, but it is a moment I've replayed 1,000 times, from my darkest days to my most decisive crossroads. And he goes on to say, what he was really explaining to me was that my life mattered, even if he had to threaten that life to make the point. I got the message. It was the same message he'd been sending me my entire life in 100 different ways. If you don't live consciously, you're not going to make it. And then again he says, as a kid, all I wanted was to know that someone cared about me. As I've said, my father and mother, my grandmother, they weren't the kind of people to walk around saying, I love you. That's just not who they were, even though I knew deep inside that they genuinely did. But when my dad gave me that talk in his car, that was one moment when I could really feel the love. So, he goes to high school, keeps his grades up, and he had dreams of going to the NBA, but he was on the shorter side, and he didn't make varsity his sophomore year. And he sort of discusses how gambling, it was more rewarding to him than basketball anyway. And the way he talks about it makes a lot of sense. And you can definitely see how it translated to his success in business, but he explains that, he cared more about succeeding with gambling than he did in basketball. So then high school comes to an end, and he's realizing, I think, as he's maturing more and more, just the harshness of street life, and wondering what else there is. So he decides to go to the University of Akron, and his father's a big part of that decision. But just when he's settling into college, he gets a call from his sister, Brandy. Finds out that his dad has cancer. So he transferred from the University of Akron to Cleveland State, I think, to be closer to him. And in February, when Rich is 19, his father passes away. And the way he talks about his father's passing, how it affected him, it really touched me. It really hit me hard. And he says, he says something about, I think this sets it up perfectly. My backbone was gone, my support system, the man who would always give me his last. I began thinking about something I thought I had put away for good. And so 10 days after, was it his father's death? I think it was his father's funeral. He made the decision to start selling crack cocaine. So now he leaves college. He's making a lot of money with his friends. He buys his first house at 19. He started diversifying as well. He even recorded music. And he does sort of credit that dabbling in different financial and sort of artistic ventures for his understanding of how to harness culture, I think is what he says. Which you can see sort of how all that led to all of those small lessons. While he was not necessarily feeling lost, but not knowing what the end game was, he still found a million little lessons in those days. So skip ahead to 2001. Rich is in New York, shopping with his friends. And I think he's at a Nike. I'm gonna stop knocking my microphone soon. He's at a Nike store and he sees these throwback jerseys on the wall that catch his eye. And he became hooked, and he started spending thousands of dollars on these jerseys that he would wear once and then hang, right? But again, it goes back to what the clothes meant for him in his upbringing and in his community. He ends up finding a store in Atlanta that sells all of these jerseys. And he eventually goes to Atlanta to work one shift or one weekend a month to get a discount at the store. So he would fly down to Atlanta on the weekend, put in a shift, and then come back with a bunch of jerseys, and he would sell them out of his trunk. eventually he was selling so many jerseys back home that the store owner from Atlanta put him in touch with the founder from Mitchell and Ness. And all of that sort of started letting him see the possibility of a future where he could step away from selling drugs. But that wasn't his reality quite yet. And he goes on to lose a lot of money. He has a really close call with the cops. And all of that is sort of detailed in the book. And he's feeling really guilty still about selling the drug that is sort of, taking over his mom's life, or has taken over his mom's life. So by the time he's 21, he's really trying to pull out of that game. And the book ends with the story of him meeting LeBron. And I don't want to spoil that. You're going to have to pick up the book to see how that happens. And it's kind of the perfect way to tell the story, because I remember reading something he said about how, when he was approached to write a book, about sort of how Clutch, a sports group, came to be, and how he manages that and everything, but he said, that's not my story. My story is, and this is not verbatim, but essentially says, my story is how Cleveland made me. So it's the perfect setup that the book ends sort of where we already know more about his story from the media. And he ends the book with an epilogue, and he sort of explains quickly that he doesn't want to glorify the life he lived and the ways that he made money. Paul's trying to escape. Because he says, he was lucky, again, to get back to luck. He was lucky that things didn't turn out worse for him. But it is still his story, and I think he sums that up really well when he says, he says, "I don't want my legacy to be money or fame or my representation of sports superstars. I hope my legacy is that my type of journey becomes the norm." And I think that's really why it is important that he tell his story so honestly. And so openly, and to put it out there that a kid with his upbringing can make it and become the most influential sports agent in the world. That's a really important message. And if you're an old person like me who's comes from a completely different world, you still won't be able to put the book down, and you still will have something to learn from his story. So anyway, that's my ramble for today. Go out and buy this book if you want to know the details of the story. I tried to keep it pretty high level and just tell some anecdotes. But I promise you won't be able to put this book down if you get it, and you won't regret it. It's a fascinating story, really well written. And thank you, Rich Paul, for writing this book. Anyway, I'll be back with another video in a few days.